Names. What is in a name? On the one hand, there is a certain paradox to names, that it is one of the most personal things that we possess, our identity, our name. And yet it is one of the few things in life that is that personal that we do not achieve or create on our own. Rather, it is something that is given and passed down to us. For ourselves, we do not need a name. We don't refer to ourselves. We don't call ourselves. It's merely a way for other people to identify us. And yet, on the other hand, our name is so inextricably tied and bound to our identity. In Torah and Judaism, names are a big deal. Indeed, the Bible in the beginning of Genesis tells us that the very first task that God gave Adam after he was created, the very first thing he did was to give names to all of the creatures of the world. The Talmud tells us that Rabbi Meir, when he would divine into the meaning of a person's name, he would be able to relate to the person about his characteristics, about his personality. Our names, the Kabbalists teach us, are actually divinely inspired to our parents to name us specifically to the root of our soul. And as the mystics teach us, that the life force, our vitality, emanates through the letters of our name. Many commentaries spend much time in the Torah discussing the names of individuals, characters, stories, and indeed Torah portions, as holding within it the essence and the energy of the entire being. Throughout the books of the Torah, all the personalities of the Torah are named, and the reasons for their names are given. As a matter of fact, the Talmud tells us that many, and indeed most of the names of Scripture, are not always necessarily the names of the individuals given at birth. Rather, they are descriptive of events, unique events that happen during their lifetime that foreshadow and foretell many of the most consequential events that are going to happen to them in their life. Which brings us to this week's Torah portion, the portion of Nasso. In this week's Torah portion, the Torah relates in great detail about the transport of the tabernacle, the Mishkan, during the 40 years of the desert, and how it was divided into three components and divided amongst three families to have the unique task of transporting the tabernacle. The tabernacle consisted of three primary components: the essential vessels, the holy vessels, the Ark of the Covenant, the menorah, the showbread table, the altars. Then there were the coverings. These vessels never traveled uncovered. They were always covered with unique coverings. And then there were the beams, the poles, the foundation sockets. These three items were divided amongst the three families of the Levites. The names that Torah relates in this week's Torah portion in great detail were the children of Levi. Levi, the third of the 12 tribes, has three sons: Kahat, Gershon, and Merari. Kahat's job was, his family was going to carry the essential vessels, the holy vessels of the Mishkan itself. The children of Gershon, they carry the coverings, the tapestries, and the coverings of the tabernacle itself, whereas the family of Merari would carry the wood, the poles, the beams, and the foundation sockets. There is a phenomenal interpretation in Kabbalah that this is a profound metaphor for the story of our lives, because indeed, as we've discussed many times, every story in the Torah is not just a moment, a snapshot in time, but is a profound and contemporary lesson, as Torah itself teaches us that Torah is a guide, not a history book, that every story and every commandment and every teaching is relevant for all peoples at all times. You know, my friends, the story of the tabernacle is a story for us too, because even though we haven't had a tabernacle or a mishkan or a temple for thousands of years, the Torah tells us that the original intent of the mishkan was ve'asuli migdash v'shachanti betocham, that you shall make me a sanctuary so that I may dwell amongst you. And as the great scholar, the Shalah, writes, that betocham means betoch kol echad ve'echad, that God intended to dwell not just in a building, but in the souls and in the hearts of every single individual. That our mandate is to create a sanctuary for God within us. And in the story and the journey of life, we are all traveling through the proverbial desert. We have just left Mount Sinai in the festival of Shavuot, where we receive the Torah. And in the desert of life where we are traveling, we are constantly in a process of going from Egypt, a place of restriction, bondage, and challenge, through a vast desert of life, on the way to the promised land to fulfill and to meet our destiny. But in that journey of life, there are three components that we must all go through when we are transporting and carrying that personal mishkan, that tabernacle, with us as we go on in life. There is the holiness, there's the aspect of the holy vessels, there is the coverings, and then there is the foundation, there's the actual poles, the structure of the mishkan. And when we look closely at the names of these children, of these families of Levi, we will find that it's not a coincidence. You see, the name Kahat, the Kabbalists teach us, means unity, cohesion. The name Gershon means exile and expulsion. Indeed, Moses named his first son Gershon, as the Torah tells us, because he was a stranger running away. And the third child, Merari, comes from the word mar, which means bitter, from the word marar of Pesach. And so these three names correspond to the three stages of life. There are times in life that we feel whole, complete. We feel elevated, refined. We are the children of Kahat. And we feel like we are holding on to the holy vessels of the temple. We can carry the temple and the Ark of the Covenant freely within us, and we feel connected spiritually. But then there are times that we feel that we are Gershon. We are exiled. We feel estranged. Indeed, for much of Jewish history, we have gone through the period, we've been vacillating between these three stages. There are highlights of our history. But for most of Jewish history, we have been in a state of Gershon, of displacement, of gerush, of exile, of spiritual divorce. And in our own past century, we have encountered the most bitter, Merari the third, the level of bitterness, that not only do we feel that we are estranged and we are in exile, but even in exile, God teaches us that we can carry the temple with us, even if we don't feel that we are connected to the actual articles and vessels of the temple. At least the coverings of it, we can take with us. You know, the Talmud tells us that one of the teachings, the profound teachings of the second chapter of the Shema, is that even when we go into exile, we still keep the Torah and the mitzvot. In the V'ahavta, it's only known that while we are in Israel, we have to keep the Torah. But in the Vahaya im Shemo, on the second chapter of the Shema, where it discusses the possibility of banishment and exile, we learn from here that being a Jew is a privilege and an obligation no matter where we are in the world, no matter what's going on geopolitically. We still have to be connected to Torah and mitzvot. But while we are in the land of Israel, when we are in a level of kahat, of unity, we feel connected to the actual ark, to the actual menorah. But then when we are at the level of Gershon, when we feel like we are banished from our land, when we feel in the moments of life that we feel estranged, we feel cold and apathetic, then God gives us the ability to at least connect to the coverings, that we feel connected to the outer structure, the layers that cover the inner core. But then there's a deeper and third and more profound and existential moment in a Jew's life, when we are B'nai Merari, we are children of bitterness, that all we know and all we have are memories. Even the memories of displacement and exile are a memory. We are living through such bitterness that we can't even connect to the fact that while we are in exile, we can't even connect to the coverings of the Mishkan. All we have are the structures, the sockets, the beams, the wood. And yet God tells the Jewish people that you should know that even in the moments of bitterness, the actual foundation of the Mishkan is carried by those who encounter the biggest hardships in life. And we should never despair that as we go through the desert and we are on the way to the promised land, we will encounter moments of highs, moments of lows. We will encounter moments of kahat, moments of great spiritual inspiration. We will encounter moments of gershon. Moments of times that we feel disconnected. We feel a sense of banishment and divorce and exile. And then even worse, we feel moments of merari, of absolute bitterness, absolute struggle. And yet, each time in life, God says, there is something productive. There is something holy that you can do. You're always connected to the temple. If you're not connected to the actual vessels of the temple, you're connected to the covering. And if you feel like you cannot connect to the covering of the temple, you can still hold on to the wood, to the beams. Indeed, the foundation of the Mishkan is reserved for those who feel most disconnected. May God bless us as we go from Shavuot through the Sinai desert on the way to the promised land, literally and metaphysically. That God shall allow us to feel those moments of kahat more than the other moments. But no matter where we are in life, always remember that the Mishkan, the inner tabernacle, is never out of reach. And if you feel like you cannot connect to the essential articles, to the holiness, to the quintessential ark, at least we can hold on to the outer layers of the Mishkan, to the outer layers of the temple during this transport of life. And when we do, we will always be connected, so that even in our moments of merari, of bitterness, and our moments of gershon, of displacement, we can reconnect back to the original paradigm of kahat, of unity, cohesion, and wholesomeness. Shabbat Shalom.